Blender actually allows us to use more than one UV map at the same time if we need to. If we go to the Object Data Properties, then we can go to UV Maps, and there you'll see a list. If you don't see anything, that's because your object has not been unwrapped yet and there's just no data there. If we hit Tab and go to Edit Mode now, our UV map has been erased. I'll hit Control Z and undo that though, and we can see our UV map here, and it's appeared in this list, and we can left click and rename it to whatever we want. I'll call it Checker Map. But then we can also add more. I'll click the plus button, and here we're going to create a new UV map. If we hit Tab to go into Edit Mode now, you'll see that there is no difference between the first and the second. And that's because it's copied the same map. So if we flip between the two just by selecting them in the list, there's no difference. But if I select the new UV map and I scale these down, and then flip between the two, then you'll see them jump, and we can edit these however we want. And it'll reflect that change. But you'll notice that in the 3D view, we're in render preview mode here, we're not actually seeing any difference. If we go to solid view, then we will see a difference, but not if we're in rendered preview. And that's because the rendered preview and the actual render itself uses whichever UV map has this camera icon. So even if you have lots of UV maps, only one of them can have this camera icon active at a time. And that's the one that's going to be rendered. So I'll go ahead and delete all these extra ones here. And we can flip to the second one by choosing it with the camera icon. Now, what I want to do here is actually use the first UV map for the checkerboard pattern, because I think that's where it fits nicely, and then use the second one to place a logo on the model. I'll just use a PNG texture with some transparency of our CGC logo. So what I'll do here is I'll select the second UV map, and I'll call this our logo map. And I'll set the first one to be the one that's rendered. Now you'll see that we have these ghost outlines here of the original UV map, and that's because we have modified turned on in our view preferences. So we could go ahead and turn that off if we don't want to be distracted by that. So it doesn't just show the modified UVs from modifiers, it also shows what's different from the rendered UV map. But I'll uncheck that here and hit N to hide our sidebar again. So now what I really want to do here is bring in that cookie logo into the material and unwrap it so that it's just sitting here in the corner. So I'll also need the shader editor, and I don't want to switch back and forth between the shading and UV editing workspace. And I use nodes often enough while texturing and unwrapping. So I'm going to left click and drag here at the bottom and drag upwards and switch this editor to be the shader editor. I'll hide the sidebar so we get a little bit more room, and bring it up a little bit, and also hide the toolbar up here since we're not going to need that much. And then add a second image texture. Shift A, texture and image. Alternatively, we could have duplicated that one or just drag and dropped it right into Blender, but then we can click open. I'll go to textures and choose CGC logo. So this is a texture. I'll hit Control and Shift and we can preview it on the model. You can see that it's blown up very large and definitely not where we want it on the model. But if I Control Shift click again, then we can see the second channel. This does actually have an alpha channel, so it tells us where the transparency is, and we can use this to mask out just the cookie. So what I'll do is hit Control Shift again just to look at that color, and I'll switch the camera icon to this second logo map. So that's the one that we're looking at. And then I'll switch the UV editor image to that CGC logo. And there we can see we need to rotate our UVs here. I'll try to make the bottom one nice and straight and scale it up just so that it's sitting right in the corner. And maybe we'll have to scale it up pretty big, but that's not a problem. And as you can see, as we scale this up, our texture is just being repeated over and over and over again. But that is not a problem. So I'll just stick this about where I think it should be, right in the corner there. And then all we need to do to get this to stop repeating is change the image texture. Right now it's set to repeat, but we can set that to clip. And now we have just one. If we set that to extend, then it's going to take the edges and stretch those all the way to the limits, and we don't want that. So let's switch this back to clip, and now we're getting just that one little logo, and we can position it wherever we want. It doesn't really matter where the other UVs are, because they're not going to show up on there anyway. So now the trick is to switch between the checker map for the checker texture and the logo map for the logo. We can do that in the UV editor. The texture coordinate only has that one UV output, and that's using whatever UV map is set to be rendered with the camera icon. But we can also bring in other UV maps with the UV map node. So hit Shift A, go to Input and UV Map, and then all we need to do is select the logo map from the drop-down list there and plug that into the logo. I'll hit Tab to go to Object Mode because we don't need to be looking at the edges and UVs anymore. And now we can switch between seeing the grid as it was in the checker map and the logo as it is on the logo map. So we just need to combine these two, and since we have a mask from the PNG texture, then that should be pretty easy. We can just hit Shift-A, go to Color and Mix RGB, and mix these two together based on the transparency of this alpha value. So anything that's white is going to be 1, which means that that will be the logo. Anything that's black is going to be the checker texture. Control-Shift, look at that mix node, and there we go. Plug that into the principled BSDF, and we're all set. So using multiple UV maps can be a great shortcut for placing different textures on different parts of the object. Just be aware though that some programs don't support multiple UV maps, so if you were to export this, for example, to Sketchfab, then you'd have to bake down the texture to just one UV map, and that's something I'll talk about later on in the course. And you'll also want to make sure that you have the correct UV map selected over here in the UV map list with it set to the camera icon if you're exporting, because sometimes you might export the wrong UV map to go with your object, and that can cause all sorts of problems. And so I've seen that happen a lot, but we'll talk about that more on later in the course when we talk about exporting our textures and things like that. The other thing I wanted to show you here about the power of UVs is animating your UVs. So just because we set our UVs over in the UV editor, we can't actually animate where those points are unless you use an add-on called Animal, but I'm not going to go into that here. But you can actually just change the location with the mapping node. So I'll expand my shader editor here. And between the UV map and the CGC logo texture, I can just place another mapping node and influence where this is being placed. So I'll hit Shift-A, go to Vector and Mapping. And here I can change the location along the X, or in this case the U, or the Y, which is the V. If we change the location along the Z, it's not going to do anything because we're only using the U and the V coordinates. But I can actually rotate around the Z, because if you think about it, that's the one that's facing directly at us if we're looking at the UVs in the UV editor. And so we can rotate our texture just like that. We can scale them and do whatever we want. And the way that we'd animate this is just by hitting I and inserting a keyframe. I want to show you a kind of a cooler example than this though. So let's move on over to the very right side, and we have this like figure 8 loop thing. And I think this would be really cool if we have the texture kind of flowing along this object. Well, this one doesn't have that second UV map, and so it's getting confused here. You can see that's showing up as red. And so we're just getting a blank result from this texture here. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete our work on this portion of it and go back to looking at just this grid texture. Again, I'm using Control-X to delete things without removing the connections, and then using Control-Shift to preview stuff, with Node Wrangler enabled, of course. So here we have our texture. We can add a mapping node here, Shift-A, Vector, and Mapping. Alternatively, we could use a vector math node, but we'll just stick with mapping for now because it's easy to remember, and the one node can do everything. If we move this along the X, you can see it rolls the texture along the curve that way. And if we change the Y, then you can see it flows in that direction. So we can totally animate this. I'll set this back to the default of 0. And then we need a timeline here. So I'll bring up a timeline. And actually, we don't really need the UV editor anymore for this, so I'll switch over to my shading workspace and bring up a timeline here. Hide that sidebar. And I'll hit period on my number pad to zoom right to this object. Okay, so we can hit I on this mapping node, and that'll insert a keyframe for the X, Y, and Z locations if our mouse is hovering over that. Or alternatively, we could right-click and insert single keyframe if we wanted to keyframe just one of them. I'm going to keyframe both the X and the Y though, so I may as well just hit I and keyframe all of them at once. Then I'll go over to, let's say, frame 100. Let's change the X just a little bit, so it looks like it's kind of rotating as it goes. Let's change that to maybe 5. Hit I to insert another keyframe, and then we can play this back to see if it's a good speed, and that's way too fast. So let's skip to that keyframe. So let's go to 0.5. I think that's closer to the value that we had before. So we went way too extreme, but okay, that looks nice. It's kind of like a snake. And then now let's change the Y. Let's go to frame 100 again, and this time I'll hold Shift let's say we want it to go about there. Let's give it a value of 3, hit I to insert another keyframe, and play this back. And there we go. We're now getting a really cool movement along this texture. Now, if we wanted to really polish this up, then we can change the curves. And I'll do that really quick here just because it's fun to see the result of this. It doesn't really have to do with texturing too much, more with animation. And for that, I definitely recommend the fundamentals of animation. But if you want to get this to loop a little bit more seamlessly, then what we can do is just move up this timeline here, and then hit Control and Tab while hovering our mouse over it, and that's going to switch us over to the curve editor. Then I'll hit period on my number pad to zoom right to our curves. And we want to get rid of the easing in and out, so that it's just a linear motion. So I can select all of my curves, and then right click and change the interpolation mode to linear. That's going to get rid of all the ease in and ease out, and it'll just be one continuous movement. Now I want it to continue all the way into infinity and not stop right at frame 100. So again, I'll select all of my keyframes just by pressing A, and then I'll go to Channel, Extrapolation Mode, and change that to linear. Now these continue on to infinity, and we can just change the Y location to change the speed. Again, for more on stuff like this, I'd recommend checking out the fundamentals of animation. Once we're happy, we can hit Control Tab, go back to our timeline, and scale that down again. I've used this effect for everything from flowing lava to waterfalls to even picking random cards out of a UV map of all the possible cards. So there's a lot that you can do here. And hopefully that shows you a couple fun examples of how cool and powerful UVs can be.